Welcome everybody to the 9th Let's Talk About seminar. This week we're talking about Cider Is Wine with Alistair Morrel, and he's joined by his Chief Cider Marketing Officer, Roddy Kane. A brief background on Alistair, first of all, is he has 30 years plus years as a buyer at Booz and Asda, plus with other leading brands. 2015 was the year when he took a career break and studied for an MBA at Henley Business School, which led him to begin his writing career. Along the way, he discovered ciders, recognizing parallels between wine and cider, and hence the topic today is Cider Is Wine. Before I hand over, just to let you know that we are recording this, you are all muted and I'm not now. There will be a question and answer session at the end, but so please do send me through your chats or any questions, and I'll unmute you and you can ask Alistair or Roddy any of your questions. Over to you, Alistair.
Good afternoon. If you'd have asked me 3 years ago what I thought of cider, I would have probably looked down my nose a little bit at you and thought of something back in teenage years that, frankly, I'd rather not go back to. And then I had one of those chance meetings through the writing.
You're not coming through very well, also.
Sorry? Sound not very good?
You're breaking up a lot.
Am I? Okay.
Not breaking up.
He's not. Okay, carry on, Alistair.
I can hear you fine, Alistair.
Okay, I'll continue. So,
yeah.
It's one of those chance meetings through the writing that I've begun doing with a gentleman called Andreas Sundgren. And he was trying to get his brand more noticed in the UK, Brandland Cider. I started doing a bit of writing for him, a bit of copywriting and that sort of thing. And then the chance came along to actually taste his product. And as somebody that's been in the wine industry for 30 odd years, I was blown away. I thought, they never told us they can make something like this that tastes like this from apples. That's incredible. And there began the journey of really Cider Is Wine. And I realized that actually there is no definition of quality of cider across the world. There is no global standard for how you produce cider. Unlike wine, where we've seemed to have taken on board this idea that wine is exclusively made from freshly gathered grapes, as per the EU law, and that seems to have become the world standard. In cider, in this country, if you buy cider, then most of it is made from about 35% juice or concentrate that's made from that juice. So you can actually import the concentrate from outside of these shores, bring it in, reconstitute it, call it British cider. We thought this was anomalous when we looked at the number of makers, cider makers around the world who are making genuine product from 100% fresh juice. And in actual fact, there is really no difference than the way that wine is made, apart from the fact it comes from apples. And thereby seems to be an interesting angle of cider that is unknown. Neither trade nor consumers have any idea that cider actually, when it's produced as a properly crafted artisanal product, is made just like wine. You take 100% freshly harvested apples, so not concentrated in any form. You scrap them, as they call them, make them into juice, in other words, and you ferment the juice, you age it, and you end up with an alcoholic drink called cider. And it's a shame, because cider's now got this dreadful reputation around the world, it seems, in almost every market, that cider is just a cheap alcoholic drink. And we're here to say, actually, it's time to look again. It's time to actually reflect differently on what cider is, how it's made, and create a new standard for cider. So Cider Is Wine was set up about 18 months ago as a quality mark to indicate ciders that are made exclusively from freshly picked apples, or in the case of Perry's, freshly picked pears. And the difference in taste and the difference in the approach of the products is chalk and cheese. When you have 100% juice ciders, they taste wholesome. They taste from where they come. They taste of terroir. We use it a lot in the wine industry, of course. Terroir is battered around all over the place. And it is really no different in cider terms either. And there are hundreds and thousands of different varieties. We read some research recently that said in the States, there's 60,000 different varieties. I mean, that's phenomenal. And apparently there are 10,000 different grape varieties in the world, and only 1,000 are produced commercially. So there's a lot of different interesting factors. In fact, it's a kaleidoscope of factors that make up these ciders. And every producer makes them very, very differently. So, sorry, so I had a bong then in my ear. So, Cider Is Wine, in order to make a difference, is very much about how we can educate consumers and the trade about these different levels of cider. We're not here to say, well, 35% cider is bad, 100% cider is good, and that's, you know, it should be like that. No, we see ourselves very much as inclusive, and that 35% product has a market, as indeed the other different levels do around the world as well. But we are here to say, actually, 100% cider is a category on its own, and it needs to be recognised as and appreciated as a product not that dissimilar to wine. It's a huge task that we face because of the competitive market of the alcohol world, but also the noise that is made by so many other products. And typically these producers are small producers. They're just like wine producers. They are in it part for passion, part for lifestyle, and in a tiny part for income. But not many of them make huge amounts of money, that's for sure. So in order to be effective, we have to club together and make as much as we can of the different resources, of the limited resources that we have, and of the producers' resources, in order to really make a noise in the competitive alcohol market. So I've got an example here of cider. This is actually an Eden cider. This is from Vermont in the USA, and from a great producer who we've made the acquaintance of. And I just, as much as I would like to get a glass in everybody's hands, which I sadly can't, I wanted to illustrate kind of what we mean. Roddy is my partner in Cider Is Wine. Roddy, are you?
I'm just opening.
Roddy, tell us how you saw the ciders when we first got together.
Well, I think I was as surprised, and I had that jaundiced view about cider. My background is I worked for wines from Spain, and then accidentally in the early 90s I sat in front of an Australian wine producer who used two words together, wine brand, and so I was one of in the right place at the right time. I claim no greater advantage than that, of realizing that Australia could produce tremendous product at a very competitive price, and a product that actually pleased an awful lot an awful lot of consumers. I'm old enough to have been brought up on drinking Retsina and such like at university. So that was a revelation. And so my experience, that was sort of 15 years of my life. I've then worked also on German wines. And in fact, it was at the London Wine Fair 2 years ago that doing something for a German client, where Alistair came up and said, I've been thinking about something, Roddy, and the rest in that sense is history, in the sense we are at the moment making history by making consumers, certainly, who are incredibly surprised when you ask them, well, what do you think cider consists of? And you say, well, in this country, it could be 35% juice, all of which could be from concentrate. But if you were in Sweden, it could be 15%. And if you were in America, it could be 50%. And if you were in Australia, there are no rules and regulations. You can call any drink cider. So it's quite we have a task in front of us in order to make consumers understand that there is this wonderful, and in some senses, this is the original English wine, that there is this extraordinary product. And of course, the difficulty we have as well is that you can understand that to produce a product with 35% juice in it, all of which, as we can say, could be from concentrate, and you can make that at any time of the year because you're not limited by harvests, is cheaper than it is to make a cider that relies on nature, terroir, climate, vintage, all of these things, just as wine. So that ciders made like wine are, in terms of pricing, more in a bracket of wine, unsurprisingly.
Because it takes, I guess it takes so much more to produce these ciders than it does to produce reconstituted must, basically.
Well, and also, I as a marketer, yes, because it's economies of scale, isn't it? If you have access to unlimited quantities of juice, your economy, you can produce an awful lot of it. If you're limited by what your orchards produce in any one year, it's a slightly different kettle of fish.
So this Eden cider, this is actually made just like champagne. It is the champagne method. And what I find fascinating about this is that, first of all, the champagne method was, to all intents and purposes, invented in England. As I'm sure many of you know, Dr. Charles Merritt submitted a paper on how to produce champagne or sparkling ciders back in 1663 to the Royal Society. But further to that, in Hereford, where we have a cider museum, it's actually based on the old Bulmer's offices. And the family Bulmer went out and went out to Champagne and learnt the champagne method from the Champenoise in the late 19th century. They came back to Hereford and built what is essentially a champagne cellar. And this is now the Hereford Cider Museum. So we were producing these types of ciders in England for quite a long time beforehand. It's only in the last 100 years or so that cider has become this kind of rather poor man's drink, cheap alcohol, you know, the white lightning, the kind of white cider kind of phenomena. In actual fact, there's a massive history of this type of production, of producing ciders just like wines. And I think another kind of interesting fact to reflect on is pre-prohibition, cider was the drink of the masses in America, because it was a lot easier to ferment apples, which had their own heat source, than actually brew a beer, which required a heat source. It's much more expensive to produce, of course, as a startup. So it was much easier to make ciders than it was beer. So in many senses, you know, ciders are reflective of a lot of history and a lot of heritage that we can actually reflect today. And arguably, we should actually be celebrating these authentic drinks made by real people, crafted These are not manufactured sort of, how many can we produce? The more we produce, the more profit we make. These are really hewn from the ground and produced with lots of passion and sacrifice, I would say. When I look at some of the ciders that we have, Wildflight, this is from Once Upon a Tree in Hereford. This is a wild yeast fermented and bottled condition. We have Welsh Mountain Cider, which James Martin loves apparently, from Prospect Orchards. And they're totally 100% juice fermented, native wild yeast, unpasteurized, unfiltered, no added sulfites. You can tell that there's a lot of passion involved in the production of these. And when we look at that alongside wine production, then you say, well, there's a lot of parallels here. There's a lot of things that draw ciders to be alongside wine and not beneath it or separate to it. It's actually very much something that sits very neatly with wine. And therefore, you know, it begs the question in time, should ciders not be seen and appreciated alongside the finest of wines? Why not? One of our producers, I've described Brandland Cider to you before, Brandland Ice Cider, is served in Michelin star restaurants, or was up until lockdown, across Europe, and greatly loved by sommeliers because of its food pairing abilities. And I guess that's kind of one of the other really interesting facets, isn't it, Roddy, about these ciders and what the part that they can play in the gastronomic experience of food matching and how that works.
Well, it seems that ciders can go with a much, where wine tends not to go, cider can go. And I'm thinking of sort of Asia and India and places like that, simply because of the way that apples can stand up to foods more than the grape can. But I don't wish to say that cider is for the East. No, it's also for the West. Cider and pork are a match made in heaven. Cider actually goes wonderfully with beef. Cider, because there is a range. We go from the driest of dry, from the brute standard of taste, right up to the most delicious dessert wines. And you've just shown the bottle of Brandland. And their ice ciders, I think, are on a par with some of the best from Bordeaux. You know, I'm fortunate that I have tried in Yquem, but I think that these ciders are as excellent and a hell of a lot cheaper than in Yquem.
Yeah. Indeed, they're certainly a lot cheaper than Yquem, and yet I think many people would struggle to identify that they were even from apples, or indeed which one was which. But I think what would be interesting would therefore be to say, which do you prefer to drink? Would you like the ice cider or would you like the Sauterne? Which do you prefer as a taste? There would be a really interesting challenge: cider versus wine. It's a bit of fun, I know, but with a certain competitive edge. I think one of the other things that really fascinates us, and I think that we can really make a difference with, is the global nature of cider. Whilst this country, the UK, is the biggest cider production unit in the world, it makes about 40% of the world's cider, and is 40% of the world's market. In actual fact, we're talking with producers and have members as producers from New Zealand, Australia, Chile, USA, Sweden, of course, UK, of course, and we're talking to producers in Germany, Poland, France, Italy, Spain, Estonia. All of these countries have a resurgence of or existing cider production where they're making it from 100% freshly harvested apples or pears, not from concentrate, and are pretty much dedicated to the idea that their ciders will always come from 100% fresh juice, just like wine. I think that's a testament to the difference that it can make to alongside wine as a separate category, and that's what I think is can be really fascinating to add to the world of drinks. If we get our way, we'll actually have a course that sits alongside the whiskey exchange that's just come up in front of me, alongside the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and other education bodies, you know, maybe the Cordon Bleu and these sort of places, because there is as much to learn about these sort of ciders as there is about wine. We're very much at the beginning of this journey, not far from the end, that's for sure.
Yeah, I must just, if I could just add lastly, if you look at the Cider Is Wine website, and Alistair's mentioned all these countries, truly we're talking to these countries and producers within them. The website, the e-commerce has been alive for a fortnight, where I'm furiously trying to populate the site, get the information from the producers so we can populate the site. It's growing all the time.
Yes, so and it's growing in interest as well. You know, as we realise that consumers and the trade equally actually are education poor in this sense, and they don't realise that cider is not made from 100% apples, or pears are not made from 100% pears. There's an assumption coming to the subject that in actual fact they're all made from 100% juice. Well, wine is. So why isn't cider? Why aren't these pears? Well, there's a difference in that history and heritage. That means that their paths grew apart over the years, and now we're seeking to bring them back closer together. And of course, there's another fantastic and very contemporary fact about these ciders. Typically, they're about half the alcohol content of a bottle of wine. And far from me to be discouraging people to drink wine, I drink enough of it myself and enjoy it and appreciate it. But at a time when consumers are wanting to drink less alcohol, these ciders actually fit a consumer profile terrifically well, and can play a part in a repertoire alcohol drinks guide, if you like.
Yeah, this Eden that Alistair and I have the great good fortune to be sipping at the moment is 8%.
Yeah.
And that's pretty well typical of ciders made like wine.
Yeah, so just to perhaps finish off our little chat and to introduce the Q&A, I'm just going to describe this. It's got a beautiful golden hue to the colour, a nice steady fizz, which has just subsided a little bit now. A wonderful nose, just ever so slightly yeasty. You've got this lovely kind of fleshy apple flavour, fruit nose, with some sort of wildflowers as well. And the palate is both light and refreshing, delicious crisp acidity, a lovely gentle, that fleshy apple, flaky apple fruit coming through, and a long finish. One of the things I find most surprising about these ciders is because of the balance of acidities and sugars, their finishes are often very much longer than wine, which I found really surprising. I would not have expected that. And this is, of course, perfectly dry. It's a brut style. I think it has about 5 grams per litre of residual sugar as a dry product. So I hope we've been able to enlighten you as to why ciders like these made from 100% juice are just like wine, and perhaps could be, and even should be, appreciated just like wine in the future. And if any of you want more information, if we can help inspire further audiences, then we're here to educate, to inform, and give you as much information as we possibly can, be a conduit to producers, and you know, help in whatever way we can.
Thank you very much, Alistair and Roddy. And we do have some questions here. I'll just unmute. Becky Sue is here. Becky Sue Epstein was Circle member, has a question for you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Becky.
Oh, hi guys. I had hoped to meet you in the UK in April, but obviously that didn't happen. And my question is, how do you deal with people in the wine industry that don't like you using the term wine for cider?
Well, we refer them back to the dictionary. If you look at the Cambridge English Dictionary description of wine, it is, and I quote, an alcoholic drink that is usually made from grapes, but can also be made from other fruits or flowers. It is made by fermenting the fruit with water and sugar. So, whilst we have been led to believe that there's only one description of wine that is wholly produced from grapes, in actual fact, in a wider world, and then the description of wine is much broader than what we've been led to believe by the EU law. That's where I start, at any rate.
I think that's a pretty reasonable answer. The next question is from Keith Granger.
Hi,
Go
Kate.
ahead.
Hi, Alistair. Given that it's probably going to prove impossible to get a legal definition of cider made from fresh juice that is acceptable to everybody, as certainly the big players are never going to accept it, do you actually need a new name for real cider?
I'm sure that's always going to be debatable, but from our perspective, we're not seeking a new name. What we have done is create this logo as a hologram. So actually, if I can, I don't know whether I can. Our members put the hologram on the bottles, and that identifies them as made from 100% juice. And not from concentrate. I don't think we necessarily need a new name. I don't think we even need a new law. But what we do need is recognition from consumers about these different ciders exist, and we need them to be able to easily identify that at the point of consumption or the point of sale.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up question just while I'm on.
Yeah.
A little bit distressed and alarmed to see on your website dictionary, Brettanomyces, a cider spoiling yeast that produces barnyard, mousy and metallic off flavours. I'd expect to see this coming out of Bournemouth. There are some fantastic ciders that have real flavours of Brett. I'm just looking actually at one I've had for America, snow-capped cider called Cider, and they promote the fact that it's fermented both primary and secondary with Brettanomyces. In some ways, craft ales and craft ciders are the new wine. At a time when the wine industry is stagnating, people are looking for a diversity of flavours, and I do think that Brett can have a role to play as long as people know what they're expecting.
Keith, I appreciate the view, and we'll take it on board, and maybe we'll refine our definition.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. And Vivian Franks has a question for you.
Hi, Vivian.
Is she offline? No, hold on. I'll just get her off. Unmute her.
No,
Right,
there
I'm
you go.
unmuted. Okay, thank you. Hello. How do the different varietals of apple influence flavors, and which are the most relevant flavor apple varietals in the UK?
Oh, that's a massive question. That's
Sorry.
a massive question. I mean, I think it's very difficult to narrow it down. Certainly, there are classifications of apples that go back essentially there are two classifications of apples. There are dessert apples and there are cider making apples. Dessert apples we all kind of know the names of, and you can make ciders from them, and there are ciders made from them. So I mean, whether that's Gala or Cox's or Bramley's even, then these are dessert apples. But then there's this group of cider making apples which then subdivide again into different categories. So you have bitter and sharp styles and bitter and sweet styles, and it all gets quite heavy duty with the different varieties falling under different classifications. And I think it comes down to personal preference in the end, and a bit of the cider maker's skill and balance, a judgment of palate. Some cider making apples can be enormously tannic. Tannin you have to kind of almost re-educate yourself about, because you're drinking something like this Eden Brut, and it still has a certain, very low, but a certain amount of tannin in it. And that's because the cider making, the apples in the cider making process, they have the skins milled into part of the juice, so they always leach a bit of tannin from there. It's about this balance of acidity, sugar, tannin, and each apple has its own perspective on that. In terms of ones that are noted by current cider makers, Dabinet is widely used and very popular. Kingston Red Streak has got a great heritage. Yarlington Mill people like, especially because of the story. It was found just one branch growing out of a mill in Somerset. And there are thousands more than any one person can ever know. And I don't think there's any single authority on it because it's such a broad subject matter. So very difficult it's the sort of thing that can go on and on in terms of education and research, and there are better qualified than me, probably as makers and makers for a long time, to talk about it. But it's a very big subject.
It's just that cider makers are looking for taste, and their taste repertoire will be different from one cider maker to another, just as much as consumers' taste repertoires are so different. I'm thinking of Willie Smith's from Australia that produces a simply stunning cider with 16 different apple varieties in it. It's all about taste and the delivery to the consumer. And I go back to my days in Australian wine, that my client then basically gave consumers permission to like wine. Before then, wine was rather this, could be seen to be a bit musty, fusty, and for an elite. And I think the same thing with cider. It has such a huge taste flavor profile, which is why it goes so well with so many foods.
I mean, I suppose the parallels with wine are quite close there with the varieties. I mean, if we look at the explosion of accepted, and I put that in inverted commas, varieties over the last 5 years or so in the UK, where people have kind of thrown off the shackles of we must drink Sauvignon, we must drink Chardonnay, we must drink Cabernet, we must drink Shiraz. And they've begun to explore and find things like Gruner Veltliner, Albarino, I mean, a huge more than that. And And so it's a journey of exploration as far as the varieties are concerned, and experimentation. I think that's the best way to see it.
I think
Thank
Sue
you.
got a nice question just to follow on the varieties there. Let me just unmute Sue.
Perfect.
Go ahead,
Thank
Sue.
you very much. Yeah, so it's just really follows on. I live in France, but my family come from Kent, where we've got great cider growers like Biddenden and so on. And there's a huge difference in the taste between the ciders I get in France and the ciders I get down there. Presumably that comes down to the varieties, or it's not a different way of making?
I would imagine.
It's both, isn't it? It's process too. There's an
Yeah.
awful lot of French cider makers produce their cider through the keeving process, which is unique to cider.
Oh, okay.
You can say more, but it comes down to terroir too, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, well we know about terroir in France.
What do you want to say about keeving, Alistair? It's very interesting.
That's
Well,
quite interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, keeving is this unique process to cider making. Major exponent of it is one of our members, Pilton Cider in Shepton Mallet. And you take the juice and it begins fermenting, and they grow a pectin kind of surface,
Yeah.
gel on the surface. And that starves the yeasts of the nutrients slowly. To such a point where actually it stops the fermentation. And
Like a floor,
It's
Yes,
sort of,
it's
yeah.
sort of.
in a way, yeah?
Yeah. And that leaves the resulting liquid, the resulting drink, out because it's now got alcohol in it, with a certain amount of residual sugar and colour as well. So, and it riches up the texture somehow as well. So you end up with a richer colour, a richer texture, and a certain amount of natural occurring sweetness, all from the apple juice.
Okay, yeah.
And that's the process that is followed predominantly in northern France. But I imagine that there's one other significant difference in the process between Kent and France, and that is that in Kent you're allowed to produce from 35% juice. In France, you're not. In France, all cider production is 100% juice.
Yeah, I mean, this is Biddenden, who we have a lot of, obviously, because I know them quite well. And they produce from juice only. So I guess it's probably the keeving. Yeah. I just wondered why, because I knew it was the same process in a way. Yeah. Thank you very much.
There are exponents here in the UK, but they're few and far between. And I think it's quite a skilled process that you have to handle quite delicately, and you have to know what you're doing.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Sue. Meg Houston-Maker here has a follow-on, really probably from the first question, Alistair Roddy. Go ahead, Meg.
Hi, thanks so much. This has been really great. Thank you. I'm interested in how you talk about terms and words you use with consumers and with members of the trade that you found to be persuasive in convincing them that cider is like wine. One of the problems that we have here in the US is that when we say cider to a consumer, they think of a sweet cider, because after Prohibition, it was an unfermented product, and cider is just pressed at harvest apple juice unfermented. And so we also often have to qualify cider as hard cider.
Yeah.
So it becomes a fairly complicated, layered narrative, right? So what have you found to be effective in convincing people that this is a wine-like product, a fine beverage?
Roddy, I mean,
well, I think we start with this, the difference. It's the 100%, it's the natural and all of that. And if we equate immediately that with, but wine has to be made from 100% freshly pressed and fermented grape juice, that puts a sort of context into things. That's certainly one of the things. And I think using wine descriptors for cider. I mean, we unashamedly use the word terroir. We use provenance. We use all of those words because actually, truly, they mean something, and they mean something particularly when looking at the industry as a whole. all we're doing is giving the consumers choice. I go into pubs on a, well, when they were open, on a hot day like today, and I would order my Orchard Pig or my Thatcher's Gold or whatever. It's a perfectly acceptable drink, but it's just not the same drink. And I think that's really, you know, what we're, we managed to communicate that in the sense of this is what our task is to say to consumers, there's a choice. There's something like this, which is fine, and you'll pay a certain amount of money for it, or there's something like this, and you'll pay a bit more for it. But my goodness, what you're in for it's a journey of deliciousness.
Meg, in terms of the actual narrative, I think there are 2 or 3 things that I would like to relay to you. First of all, cider is wine. It's a question as well as a statement. And it therefore intrigues people, because if it's a question, I have to answer it. But also it causes people to say, no, it's not, which gives me the opportunity of actually saying, well, in actual fact, it is. By the strict definition, according to the dictionary, it is, but not by common parlance and how we see wine today, which is typically that it's made from grapes, and not by EU law. But if we take the same standard for wine and apply it to cider, then you've got something that is alongside it. I think the other aspect, so when we're at consumer events, or when we've done our online events, and we do online events now, then we say, when you go to the shop and you buy, or your wine list, and you buy a bottle of wine, what percentage of grapes do you expect has gone into that bottle of wine to make it? And you ask the question, and you get a certain amount of feedback from that, and people say 10% or 50% or maybe 100%. And when you go to the shops and you buy a bottle of cider, what percentage of apples do you expect it to have? And you get a certain amount of feedback about that. And through those set of questions, then you end up by drawing a conclusion for the consumers about what they want themselves and what they would like to be putting in their glass, and they make their own mind up, because that's what all we're here to do, is kind of following on from what Roddy says. I think the other interesting analogy really is about orange juice.
My favourite, Alistair. Yes.
Your favourite, Roddy. Yes. I mean, when you go to the supermarket and you buy orange juice, do you buy concentrated or do you buy freshly squeezed? Which would you prefer? And again, through that, we can make the same analogy with ciders. It's not quite the same in the United States because of course you have that definition between hard cider and regular cider.
Can I ask a follow-on question though? In the US, a lot of cider producers are using concentrated, reconstituted juice. But there are a tremendous number of cider makers who use leftover supermarket fruit. They put the fruit in cold storage, and every 4 weeks they're milling out of storage. So it's technically from fruit, but it's not a harvest product. And I think that talking about cider, hard cider, as a harvest specific product, that to me is much more analogous to winemaking, which no one is, well, except for the, Amarone producers, nobody's storing grapes and pressing out of cold storage throughout the winter.
Well, they couldn't.
Right.
I mean, grapes wouldn't survive. I mean, they would, you'd struggle to produce a product on any scale anyway. It would be tough to do that.
But I guess what I'm saying is it's a little bit of a loophole in your definition. If there are a lot of producers who are pressing fruit out of cold storage year round, and those apples, to quote Eleanor Leger, they have no flavor by January. So really, I think a distinction here that's critical is the apples are milled and pressed when they're at peak ripeness for cider making?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm talking to cider makers. That's always what they say.
Yeah.
We pick it at peak ripeness for the cider they want to produce, and they handle it. I mean, it's impossible to make a phone call to a cider maker in these islands from late September through till Christmas, because they're busy making their product.
And the vast majority of them have a vintage definition on their cider production.
Right.
So.
And we don't, in the US, they don't allow a vintage labeling of cider.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
You can put a batch number or a lot number, and Eleanor and Sebastian, who are on this call, can actually speak to this with much greater authority, because they're dealing with the TTB, and I'm not. I'm just a writer, but it's insane to me as a wine writer and a cider lover that's true in the US.
But you're right. I'm looking at Eleanor's label here for the dry heritage. You're right. There's absolutely no vintage on there at all, and no reference to the year whatsoever.
Yeah, I noticed the batch on the Cinderella's slippers here, though, is 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, all right.
Which is a cute sidestep, I guess, of the vintage.
Anyway, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. I'm working on a project now to try to figure out how to communicate these differences to the consumer, and I do believe cider's like wine, so I really appreciate your insights.
No, well, that's great. And thank you very much for that insight on vintage, particularly from a United States perspective. That's very helpful from our
No, thanks for the question, because we're learning too. I mean, it's this is a new journey. Nobody has done or tried to do what we're doing currently. Hence my interest when I met Alistair again 2 years ago.
Oh, that's great to have just more of a global aspect or perspective about cider, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's Jensen here. We've got a question. I think you mentioned it, Roddy, about the food and wine pairing. Go ahead, Yep. Hello?
I understand. Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, just.
Okay, okay.
Very
Thank
faintly.
Participating from South Africa. Okay, I understand the similarity with white wine, for instance, to the Sauvignon Blanc, right? I understand that. Even wine pairing with Asian food, that must go very, very well. But the host or the speaker mentioned it also goes well with beef. And there arose my question, because has the cider enough tannin that it can break down the egg white as the protein of beef? That's my question.
Did you hear that, Roddy? It's about
Yes.
cider have enough
Whether it goes with beef,
down.
well, the answer is just as much as there's consumers have the ability to choose red or white wine or rosé to eat with anything. What is it? It is a question of personal taste. I accept entirely that cider and white wine perhaps are seen more as a sort of single entity, but there are some very, very robust ciders out there that would go with much stronger meats and would go wonderfully with pies and stews and all of these things, and game, and just as much as I learnt many years ago, there is nothing to stop you drinking red wine with fish, and there have been plenty of Frenchmen have told me that, and indeed I've had wonderful dishes of white fish cooked in with a red wine sauce. I think it works the other way. It works the other way too. I think it's time, if we experiment, if we have a look, if we put no boundaries on what we're drinking and what we're eating, and experiment and find what works best for us together, then I think and Alistair, you'll tell me that there's an awful, the tannin in ciders does cut through an awful lot of rich food.
Yeah, indeed. I think we've all got a huge journey to go on here in terms of how we have to almost reset our palate in a certain sense, because we've trained ourselves through the white wine, rosé wine, red wine kind of formula, if you like. These ciders are often different. You can have very high tannic ciders, but they look like white wine, or they have a golden color. And therefore, because we're led by our eyes, then we kind of, we deny what we actually then taste and what we actually take on as texture. And so I think we have to kind of look at these a bit different, and find the more tannic styles of ciders and experiment, as Roddy says, experiment with the beef and put it with that and test it in those high level gastronomic environments. I mean, this is a menu from M restaurants in London. I mean, obviously now shut at the minute, but this is a dinner that we put on last year with Branland and Martin Williams from M restaurants. And the main dish was USDA prime tenderloin, 150 grams, with Wagyu fat, junior cooked parsnips, and apple jus. And they served with that the Branland Panilla Pearl. So I know that there are these places where we can actually push the envelope and try and do that. And I think that whilst it looks like it's a contradiction putting a cider with beef, I think there are ciders that actually will stand up to that test. And I look forward to sharing that with you when you're next in London, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, you really just answered the question. If you have a cider with enough tannin, but I didn't know that there was. That was my lack of knowledge.
Tannin is a big feature of these sort of cider making. It's and again, I think we have to reset what we know and what we understand. It's certainly been a learning curve for me, because I didn't expect it, probably like you're expressing. I didn't expect that 3 years ago. If you'd have told me that ciders have tannin, I would say no. They're just sweet, aren't they? And just, you know, or they're dry, but, you know, no, they definitely do.
Okay. Thank you so much, and a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and there's a question here from Billy Abbott. Go ahead, Billy.
Hi guys. Apart from your good selves, are there any resources out there to, books or websites or organisations to learn more about cider in general, and sort of like dig into the history as well as what's going on at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of resources. There's a lot of history in this country, and certainly you could start with Elizabeth Pimblett at the Cider Museum, and she's very accessible, and I think that would be a great a starting place. There are writers like Felix Nash. Of course, Gabe Cook is quite visible. More populist, I would suggest. Susanna Forbes, of course, has written her own book, which is, very authoritative. Yeah, I'm sure there's much more to be identified. But if you want history and heritage, I would go to the Cider Making Museum in Hereford. That would be a great start.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's one more question just from Keith, going back to heading back to France again.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Keith.
Hello again. Hello from the Charente-Maritime. It's lovely and sunny here, approaching 100 degrees at the moment. So
I'm totally jealous. I'm totally jealous.
We're doing quite nicely. Okay, some fantastic ciders from England. some fantastic ciders from USA. I mentioned the Colorado snow-capped cider from over 6,000 feet high earlier. But of course, there are some great ciders from France. And I see at the moment you haven't got any French producer affiliates. Would you like some? Are you trying to get some?
We'd love some.
We're talking to Brittany at the moment. But of course, this all happened literally the week before lockdown. So both countries have been completely stymied, but we're still in email contact. But we would love to talk to more French cider makers, because, you know, this is a great market for France.
Yeah. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you, Keith.
Okay, I think that covers about all the questions. Yep, one more question was, any good ciders here in South Africa?
Well, we've been talking to, or we have had some contact with Bruce Jack and Paul Kluver at, I can't remember the name, Roddy. Can you remember the name?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask me.
But I could email you separately.
Thank you.
I think it's the Paul Kluver estate.
The name of the cider, I can't remember the name of the cider that we talked about. We'll find it.
Okay. I think that just about covers all the questions.
Can I raise my hand with one thing?
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
This is Eleanor. I put in the chat a link to the 3-minute video that Meg did on Vermont terroir, which I think really gives you a sense of, you know, it's unique to Vermont, but it gives you the sense of what cider makers like us around the world are doing and thinking. So if you want to get the essence of the feeling, watch that video.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Yes, thank you very much, Eleanor. We've got that up on the screen now, so anybody can link to it. Well, I'd like to, say thank you very much to Alistair and to Roddy for giving us an introduction on your cider road that you have ahead of you. Quite a task ahead, but I think we've, you know, now you've given us an idea of another category that everybody can now think of, something not quite as expensive, but offers just as much as wine does. But obviously we've all heard of the Judgment of Paris, but we can watch this space, can't we? Cider versus Sauternes. We look forward to it.
Bring it on.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.